Hello everyone, welcome back to another lesson with Rivera Fine Art Studios. So what I'd like to do today is to continue to talk a little bit about these basic shapes, the basic shapes of spheres, cylinders, and in this case, a dome shape. And I'm going to do a still life drawing from these objects, and then I'm going to relate this to a figurative painting so we can see how these simplified forms can really be found on the figure. So what I'm doing is I'm creating my lines with a double-sided shader, and this has some charcoal already smeared on it, which gives me very soft lines. Okay, so if we start to examine these shadow shapes, I have form lighting, and if we look at the sphere, that area about 1/3 or so, 1/3 to 1/4 of that right side is falling into shadow. So I'm just going to draw that shadow shape out. And then what we have happening underneath that on the cylinder is a cast shadow. So a cast shadow that moves down at an angle this way. And then again, about 1/4 of what's left falls into form shadow on the right side of that cylinder. And then what happens in this area is we kind of lose the shadow altogether. It's sort of a cast shadow, very thin sliver of that cast shadow falling behind this dome shape. And then as I move into the downward plane here, the shadow angles back in this way. But this whole area really fills up with light because that's more of a top plane that the light is hitting. So just to sketch that in, I do have to continue a little bit across where that shadow kind of moves this way, and then it more or less disappears as it falls behind this edge of the curve, and then it turns again into a form shadow as I start to move down this side plane. So this next part I've just sped up. I'm just blocking in my light values with my General's white charcoal pencil. And this is important to do pretty early on, especially when you're working on gray paper, because it helps to gauge the contrast between your lights and your midtones. So now I've just blocked in my darker values, and I'm looking at these as unified shapes. And I'm just smoothing everything out now with a stiff bristled brush, just making all of my values very smooth and even. Okay, so here once again is where we see quite a bit of a transition. So this edge right now is a little bit too sharp, but just kind of looking at how that edge relates to the edge here of the cast shadow. So again, the form shadow is the shadow on the sphere, which is rolling away from the light, and the cast shadow is the shadow which is being cast by the object. And there's very distinct differences between the edges of those shadows where the shadow and the light come together. So what I would want to do is just kind of break over that sharp edge. So I'm going to switch over to the brush that I was using to blend my dark charcoal. And I'm going to soften that a little bit, just by brushing over it, and turn that into a softer edge. And I'm just kind of pulling some of the value towards the light when I do this, towards that light side. But I don't want to necessarily mix the white charcoal with the black charcoal. I want to still let some of the paper come through. So I'm going to go back with my kneaded eraser and lift out some of that light. But right now I'm just trying to soften the edge coming off of that core shadow to make that more subtle and have a smoother, more gradual gradation. Okay, now with my kneaded eraser, I can shape that into a pretty nice point, and I can just pull out some of that white charcoal that I had put down to create more of a halftone. Okay, now we look at the cast shadow here, and I'm not going to really change that edge too much. I'm going to keep that pretty sharp. I might just soften it a tiny bit, but I want that edge to remain pretty sharp and pretty crisp. So instead, what I'm going to focus on is this vertical shadow that's moving down the side of the cylinder, because that's actually a form shadow, and that edge is going to be a little bit softer and more gradual as it transitions into the light. So one thing that we notice when we look at the still life is that this shadow shape is still a little bit more distinctive. The edge of that shadow is more distinctive than the form shadow of the sphere, because that turning is much more abrupt. But it's still softer. That transition is still softer than my cast shadow. And what I can do is just slightly exaggerate the darkness of the cast shadow a little bit, create a little bit more value contrast right there, and make that shadow appear even stronger shape there by increasing those contrasts. Now I'm going to come back in and just strengthen the light. So these would essentially be the highlights where the light is really hitting the form directly. So right in here, close to the left side, but not all the way over. Somewhere right about there. And then the same thing with the sphere. I would have a highlight that's somewhere in here. It's falling towards the left side, that upper left region, but not all the way to the edge, somewhere right in about that area. Okay, so then again, a cast shadow right here, so I'm going to leave that edge pretty sharp, and then form shadow here, so this will start to soften again. So there's really this pattern happening of a soft edge, hard edge. So soft edge, form shadow, hard edge, cast shadow, soft edge, form shadow coming down the cylinder, hard edge, cast shadow, and then soft edge, form shadow. So it alternates. Okay, so now what I'd like to do is take a look at this portrait painting by the French neoclassical artist Jean-Auguste Dominique Ingres. And I'd like to talk about how he used these basic forms to construct this portrait. So one of the reasons why I chose Ingres to really study is because of the way in which he represented his forms. They are very simplistic and idealized. So even looking at the neck, that is really nothing more than a cylinder, and it relates very closely to the still life, which I did, and then the shoulders just kind of slope right off of that form. So if we ignore the features, if we just go back to this shape, it is very, very similar to the sphere. There's a little bit more taper towards the jawline. It becomes a little bit more angular down here. The upper portion, though, is still very round like the sphere. And if I'm to add some light and shadow to this, so again, I'm going to ignore the features. I'm just going to go with sort of a generalized value that falls into the face. And again, the face is a flesh tone, so it's not going to be quite as light as my sphere because that was a white object. Here I have a fairly light value, but it's not a pure white. So I'm just going to throw that in and just kind of block these in rather quickly to get some sense of the light values, and then I'm going to work the shadows into this. So one thing I do want to include is the hair line, because that breaks up this front plane. So this all becomes dark. It kind of frames the face out. That's a shape that I will include. And some of the differences that you get between a simple form like this and a more complex form like this, other than the details of the features, is the differences in the local values. And I can touch on that in another lesson, but right now I just want to wrap this up. So I'm just going to throw some darks in, simplify that into one solid value. So the hair is a different local value than the flesh, and then my shadow down here is a little bit lighter than the value of the hair. So we can kind of break this up into really three basic values. We have the flesh tone in the light areas, which would be basically the lights. We have the shadow areas, which would be more of a mid-tone, and then we have the hair and the irises in the eyes and the eyebrows and such, which would be darks. So I'm going to attempt to represent all of those values in this drawing. So as I move into this cast shadow on the neck, I'm noticing that that is quite a bit darker than the form shadow on the head along the jawline. So it's very similar to what I did in the actual still life. Okay, so now if I start breaking this up a little bit, you kind of want to go with your primary shape. You always want to keep in mind what your primary shape is. So I never want to lose sight of the fact that the head is essentially an oval. There is a subdivision of planes that happen in here, so that can be indicated with just a slight variation within the edge of my shadow. So for example, if I look at the cheekbone, it creates a little dip right here. And just a slight adjustment on the edge of that shadow will show that the cheekbone comes in right there. And then I have another variation right here where I move into the temporal ridge. So once again, I can just kind of pull some shadow into the side, into the front plane of the face to indicate those extra shadows, which essentially are indicating additional plane changes. So now, once again, I'm just going to pay attention to some of those halftones that are going to help to transition the edge of my form shadow into the light. And now I'm going to also add the darker portion of the cast shadow, which happens right underneath her jawline, which is, again, very similar to my still life. Okay, so that pretty much sums up my demo for today. And I would definitely recommend looking for these forms when you are drawing portraits and figures, and trying as much as possible to simplify it. So, thinking about, once again, going just back to these basic structures. So the head is basically nothing more than a sphere, and the neck is really nothing more than a cylinder. And then we just start to divide those parts up and add our secondary forms on top of that, and then our tertiary forms. So we get more and more detailed and start breaking those forms up a little bit more as the drawing develops, but we still don't want to lose sight of what those general initial forms are. So next week I will do another demonstration, and I will talk about the forms, the simplified forms that we can find on the figure. So until then, happy drawing and painting.